guys? This is Chris from DSX Machina, and in this series of videos, I wanted to talk about my experience as a games master and as someone who's played a lot of role-playing games. I've played role-playing games since the late 80s. I started off with basic D&D, this Star Wars, West End game Star Wars, did a lot of Mechton, a lot of Cyberpunk, and some GURPS even, and eventually returned to D&D, and then hung with D&D mostly through all the 2000s. And I have a lot of experience in gaming, so I wanted to create a series of lists more for those who are curious about my favorite moments in my gaming life. Since obviously we don't stream our game sessions, I don't have a lot to I can't replay these for you. We record a couple of them. You can see them on our channel. They're very, very few and far between. And so I wanted to kind of showcase some of them. This is not the top funniest moments. That's another list. This is the beginning of a list of the top moments I had as either a player or as a GM. Full disclosure, there's very few moments as me as a player. I was a GM for almost all of it. So this is a list specifically rooted on all of my favorite moments as a GM in a gaming group. So story time. I'm compiling these into probably 4 parts just because there were a lot to go through, starting with number 20, Enclave and the video. And for this story, we have to go to my Amethyst game. A lot of these are going to be from Amethyst. And we're going to talk about a little bit later about some of my use of music and video. And if I ever do an advice for good role playing, which is something I've always been planning on doing, we'll talk about that. Anyway, so we're going to fast forward not to the first Amethyst game, of which the first 3/4 of it are encompassed in the 3 Amethyst games. One of them is right behind me. We're actually going to go forward past that, not into the second Amethyst campaign, which we haven't even touched, but the third Amethyst campaign. And we involve our characters that are going to what they think is the bastion of Porto. Now, if you've read Amethyst Revelations, you'll know Porto is the most advanced bastion. It is an incredibly futuristic utopian city that responsibly blends new technology and kind of progressive ideals. It's very green, all the power is entirely ecologically friendly, renewable resources and the like. However, when our characters reach it in this episode, they find it's gotten a lot more xenophobic. It's walled, and there's absolutely no communication to the outside world. This might be a spoiler. We'll see if anyone actually remembers this in the distant future if I ever get to doing this. Anyway, so they have to there's a train that moves in and out of the city. It goes out of the city and goes back, and it seems to be automated. No one seems to be on it, so they have to get on this train first to get into the city. That itself takes a whole session. They have to compete with other people. They have to get on. They have to get inside. And there's a conflict. There's a bit of an issue with the players because they don't believe that they should be able to get inside. There's always been the situation, sometimes with my player group, where I create a situation where the players believe it is impossible. And so there's a part of them that feels it's unrealistic for them to have a chance to intervene. And this is a common thing. I may pop up in my advice section about whether or not that works. I might even talk about this as being the memorable session because I'm trying to keep this to positive, and that was a bit of a stressful moment. But they get in this train, they get inside with the hopes of communicating with the people of this bastion. They kind of, I won't say fall unconscious, but they're inside this train and they have no contact with the outside world. The train opens, they exit it, and they exit into this farmland. And there are old-fashioned 18th century farmhouses and a few cottages, but it's mostly just farmland. And they are initially very confused. The fact that this entire bastion, what was once Porto, is just now farmland, and it seems to be just, at best, it would probably have a couple hundred people. Like, the city is gone. And then they go into these buildings and they find that they are abandoned. They're maintained, but they're abandoned. They don't know who's sustaining them. Eventually, they do find a elevator that takes them down, and that's when they realize that that's basically a subsurface area for food and so forth, but there's actually like the city is completely underground. So they think, this is good, we're going to go underground now. So they go underground, and it's got a holographic sky. It's almost a full city underground. The city is very much modeled under Dubrovnik. I was using images of Dubrovnik For those people who don't know Dubrovnik, I think King's Landing in Game of Thrones was shot around Dubrovnik. And so the players are like, okay, this is good, only to find that the vast majority of this city is completely abandoned. Everyone who is living a very monotonous, methodical life. They're working in computers, they're typing things away, they go home, they're not socializing. They've just become cogs in a machine. In fact, the only human interaction they're finding is with the small number of AI androids that are basically keeping the population alive, but they're not even enslaved. They don't understand why people have just gotten into this humdrum existence. The radio spouts very frustratingly drab and really like nihilistic poetry. I even did a video which just shows the front of an old-fashioned radio, and it's playing this. I grabbed a poem, the most kind of a well-known poem, but one that's just so dense. And I put it through filters to give it that radio sheen, and I played it. And one of the players got so frustrated, he tried to destroy the radio, but he couldn't. He'd throw out a window, it would still play, like he would do everything in his power. And the joy from this session was to constantly disappoint the players, because like they were expecting that they would be in a fight, or they were expecting that they would have to do skill challenge and have to interact with people, and every single time they would enter like a new aspect of this story, it just became disappointed because they just got frustrated at the surrealness. It's amazing how when you break reality down and things don't gel with the expectations, how frustrated players can be. And it's funny because frustration can be a kind of a cathartic moment for a GM who is enjoying players who are invested in a session so much that they're getting frustrated on their character's behalf because they can't seem to figure out what's going on. They can't seem to interact. They can't seem to really kind of understand, wrap their heads. Like they can't defeat. There's nothing to defeat. They just have to put up with it until they finally kind of get their answer. Like it's a labyrinth of the mind, and I wanted something that was almost David Lynchian in its absurdity. It was a very interesting thing, but it culminated at one point with them going into a couple of the characters, because they were splitting up and doing different things, going into a movie theater. And in the movie theater, it had nobody in it, but it was playing the same clip. And it was a 4-minute clip that just played the history of the Earth, the history of mankind specifically. And it detailed the beginnings of civilization. And it did it through a montage of black and white and eventually color video broadcast that just goes in showing how unbelievably warlike and destructive mankind is. But as we move in, and this is a 3-minute video, the videos become more progressive, more tolerant. Dictators are brought down. We see more utopian society rise up. And if you know Amethyst, right when humanity is trying to finally improve themselves, this asteroid hits without warning and basically knocks all of that down. Now you're probably thinking, how in the world did a games master with a group of 5 people have a montage? Well, I made it. I will go into that more into kind of the advice videos later on. But yeah, I spent hours and hours and hours creating this this montage, and I used a lot of old footage. I put it to a piece of music from an anime, and eventually I looped in some game CGI, some cinematic CGI for the more modern stuff. But I was very proud of it. Because it was one of the few times I was trying to do something that was something the characters see as well as the players, and it was a very weird thing. But it has no bearing. It's just something that adds to the weirdness of everything that's happening. It was heavily inspired by an anime called Technolize, and if you've seen it, then you might know what I'm talking about. Even the piece of music I used was from that anime. But that's something that, once again, give an example as it's a gaming aspect. This list is not going to be about this was a great battle because someone rolled a 20. This is things that happen in games that happen either organically as an interaction or something that as a player that I encountered, or as a GM, I was able to create this narrative that the players responded very positively to. And in this case, that reaction was enjoyment, but also frustration. And one player was specifically very frustrated, but he was frustrated on his character's behalf because he was getting so angry at the absurdity of the location that they had found themselves in. So that's number 20. Number 19 goes meta, and we're talking about title sequences. Title sequences is not something that's going to make a lot of sense to people, to my players that maybe watch this, they'll understand. At the beginning of the Amethyst era, which starts in 2000, I wanted to create something to kind of signify that we were gaming. Players get together, we chat, we'll have snacks, and we don't necessarily have, I can't hit record if we're streaming the session and now we're going to play. It's hard sometimes to get people, and some players get frustrated. We're like, no, I get there within half an hour of arriving, we need to start gaming. I don't want to talk and hang out, I want to game. So I created something to kind of tell players that now we're like, get your chatting out of the way, we're going to be doing this. And it was a title sequence because I used to use music a lot. This is something we'll talk about later in videos of how much I use music and how detailed and how specific the music I use is. And like, I don't just play ambient background music. I prep specific tracks for specific moments. And in Amethyst, there was a piece of music that a lot of my players associate as being the theme song. So I would just kind of play that at the beginning. But that turned into, okay, now I'm going to create a slideshow. Amethyst was heavily inspired by a lot of artwork. I got permission to use this artwork for the homebrew game. I approached many of these artists to do professional work for Amethyst. Several of them did. Nick became the primary voice. But at the beginning, we had a bunch of different artwork from different artists. And so I spliced those into a slideshow that the players would see. And I did this for years. For the majority of the Amethyst campaign, the first Amethyst campaign, the second campaign in the Amethyst series called Cradle, I did the exact same thing, slideshows. And then in the fourth season, because I do break them up into seasons because we take little breaks, I tried something different. And instead of doing as a slideshow, I put it to video clips. And I downloaded video clips, mostly game cinematics. And it was a clash between fantasy and science fiction. And I spliced them together. The editing, this is once again mid 2000s, early 2000s, mid 2000s. So it's very low quality, 640 if I'm lucky. And there aren't any good video editors that you can get for free at the time. Windows Movie Maker had one that was pretty good, but they were all basically very low quality. And I did my best to splice these in, and there would be, say, 20-30 cuts in a 2.5-minute teaser, and that was the opening credit. I'd have the Amethyst logo. At this point, the game was being developed, so we actually had a logo for Amethyst. And because the first ones didn't. First ones had if you go back to the old Serena Dunn page, which is you can find on way back, you can see the old logo for Amethyst. We were using that, and then eventually it became Nick Greenwood's logo, which we've been using ever since. But if there's a personal joy in creating these, I actually really like making them. But I always felt that I did it for myself, and that was it. But when I first started doing the video clips, the players responded very positively. They're like, play that again. That was really cool. And I got such positive feedback that became a thing. So for season 4, like every session we sit down at the game, we'd always start with playing that slideshow, which became a video montage of 2.5 minutes. To the point where in our last session for that game, I made another one specifically for that session. So it was only played once, and that's it. And ever since then, every time I did a season of a game, it would have its own unique title sequence montage with a new song. Every single time was different. And it's just something I did. So when we did Apotheosis, and when we did Cradle was second. What am I thinking of? No, Logos was when it happened. It was 4th season of Logos. And then Cradle, we did it for all 4 seasons. Every season had one. And in these montage sequences started to get more developed to the point where I would have them in the middle of the game as well. We would have montages of traveling, montages of this, and sometimes specific battle moments or moments of drama. I would have a sequence where I would put it towards some clips that I felt really fit the scene. Some of the seasons would have 15 or 20 of these. It became a staple of what I did. And even when we got into the last few seasons with Apotheosis, it moved to the HD era, and then suddenly I got to use HD. Nowadays, if I did it, yeah, it would be really high quality game cinematics with a lot of it would be 4K, and the cuts got insane. By the time we got to the end, we were looking at 195 cuts in the same length of time, 2.5 to 3 minute videos. Most of the songs were trailer music, like music that's made for trailers. So some of them you may recognize, some of them were somewhat famous. And sometimes I'd make 2 or 3 and I would reject them and then use another one. So I was like going through, just before I recorded this, I was seeing all the different videos I made. But yeah, that's something I really love doing. And if I would run another long-term game, I would probably do that. When I did my Affinity game, I didn't. I knew it was just going to be like 6 sessions. But if I started up an actual campaign with people committed for a long haul, I would actually probably do one of those. But I haven't done one in quite some time. On to 18. And I call this Alien Session 1. Now, this isn't, eventually we're going to talk about Session 0, and that's going to be something else. Now we're talking about story and plot. I ran an Aliens game. It's based off of Aliens Fusion, which I created in the mid-90s. This is not using the current established setting or the rules of the recent Aliens game, which I actually own. I just haven't played it. And some people who know me know I was a bit of an authority on that series. I did a lot of research. Some of the lore has been retconned. They've played around with the lore, but let's ignore that for a second. My first session was actually pretty interesting. The whole idea, the concept of the campaign I ran was that the players were creating, the creators were Marines, pretty commonplace, but they were actually formed specifically by someone to investigate what was happening. The idea is that it's set 3 years after Alien 3. We actually and a Admiral Frost, the father of Frost, who was in the movie Aliens, who gets killed, is not satisfied with the stonewalling that Weyland Yutani is giving him regarding the death of the Marines on LV-426, specifically his son. So he forms a group of Marines that he believes can be tasked to clandestinely and off the books investigate this situation. He was going to give them a ship called the Deterrent. It wasn't a Sulaco-like ship. It was a slightly different variation, which was an illustration based off of Dark Horse. There's a lot of Dark Horse in the Aliens game that I created. And, but to get to that point was actually, there was a lot of preamble. It opens up with this Weyland Yutani task force, this elite task force who possess more advanced weaponry than the Marines do. They are breaking in to the space station, and they are attacking. They're shooting people up, and they're grabbing something. They're stealing something. They get on their ship. They escape, and they get on this ship, and it's literally is a black ship. It's a black ship. It's off the books, but it's also painted black. And these corporate security like task force reveals what they've stolen from this space station. We reveal this space station as being the Union of Progressive People, which is from William Gibson's Alien 3 script, which back in the day no one knew about. Now people actually kind of have some experience. You can actually read the script, and there's a radio play and a comic book. But back in the late 90s, early 2000s, this was not existed. You had to find this script, and so very few people had actually read it. And this task force opens this up, and he discovers that they have stolen alien eggs. We don't know how UPP has gotten hold of it, but we do know now at this point in the story that the William Yutani has stolen several eggs. We then jump to a Force Recon team, which is a Special Forces Colonial Marine team, Force Recon, that is tasked with breaking into this corporate office to steal some digital information. We reveal at this point that two of the characters in this 4 team are actually 2 player characters. So we introduce 2 of our 4 player characters. They escape, and around the same time, we see a graduation ceremony where these Marines are graduating, and I implied in the lore, this is obviously completely non-canonical, that the character we know of Ellen Ripley, obviously her daughter is dead at the time of Aliens. There's been talk that she wasn't, but whatever. That while she was upset about that, she also had a brother and had a niece that she was not aware of. At this point, a great niece that she wasn't aware of. And in this off-tangent story, they actually meet, and she gives Ellen Ripley gives this great niece Joan's cat to look after her while she goes to LV-426, and of course she doesn't come back. As it turns out, these are some of the characters that we're going to be dealing with in this campaign. And then we meet up with Frost, Admiral Frost, who has gathered these people together. He grabs this lieutenant, this master sergeant, who are player characters, the Force Recon people who are player characters. We get them together, and we have Session 0, which I'll talk about later on the list because it's much higher, because it's one of the better things that I think I've ever done. Their first mission is investigating this crash of this spacecraft nearby, because they believe they think they can grab some information from it because they believe it's a Weyland-Yutani, a corporate security vessel, and it might have information regarding what happened on Acheron. So the characters go to the crash site. It's on this desert planet, and when they investigate it, it's the same ship from the introduction. So this is one of those cool things where the characters are going, well, this is a crash ship. We're just going to get on board and investigate it. And apparently it's been down for about 3 years, pointing at the events earlier actually occurred a long time ago, or just it didn't happen yesterday. And the players are going in, and the characters are sort of walking into this ship wreckage that has crashed, like kind of soft landed. But the players are like, this is incredibly sketchy, because they know something that their characters don't. And I do that quite a bit in my gaming. I play with stuff where the players are aware of something, which happens all the time, obviously. They just kind of try not to play into it, but sometimes I throw something directly in the players' faces where they know something that their characters would absolutely know, and they have to kind of pretend to ignore it. So they're just going through this ship, not expecting anything hostile, because they know that this thing crashed 3 years ago. There's absolutely no survivors. They're going in to find this, while the players are pissing themselves because they're worried that there's going to be an engagement with aliens, because obviously something brought down this ship, and it was probably relating to the eggs that they brought on board. And funnily enough, it doesn't lead to anything, because although they get their information, which continues them to find this space station, the eggs are not there. The aliens are not there. There's evidence that there was a battle. Obviously, the ships got taken down because of it. But the eggs and the aliens, there's no evidence other than acid burns, what's going on. So there ends up not being even a battle. So they're like prepping and bracing themselves, and they're paranoid at the end. There was never a battle. It was just this foreboding creepiness that was going into it. And that was just the first 4 or 5 hours. That was our first session. And the next session, they were going to go to the space station. So I really was kind of happy with just the kind of the plotting. I felt there was a good ramping of story involved in that. But that's my Aliens session 1. Number 17, The Prophetic Letter. For this, we have to move into another campaign, another game I created called Necropolis. You can find this game. The setting is in Ultramodern 5. I haven't published it as a separate device, as a separate publication, but I might someday. Anyway, so The Prophetic Letter was something that occurred. For those people who know Necropolis is a brutalist dystopian kind of campaign. It's set hundreds of years in the future. Most of the world is basically just a giant brutalist city, and you can't see the sun. The characters are basically surrounded on all sides by featureless, windowless buildings. And in this setting, there's this weird psychokinetic mass called the skin that is corrupting people and can also form animalistic and monstrous forms. And on top, so it's cyberpunk, it's brutally dystopian. There's weird psychic monsters, and then there's superpowers. Many of the players have superpowers because we were using the setting from Apex, so the players all had superpowers. And so because they had superpowers, they were being drafted into this organization with this multinational corporation, which allowed them to live in luxury, but they had to do missions for them, which involved them investigating the skin threat and trying to defeat it. At one point, they have to fly to the ruins of Prague, and they find the ruins of this old museum. And one of the players is tracing his old mentor. His old mentor trained him in his powers, and he was known as being a prophet. He could predict the future, and he goes into detail more and more, learning more and more about how he was able to do what he could do. But he's missing, and they go into this old museum. I have photos of old museums I was using for references, and they were like going through it, and then eventually this player finds a letter addressed to him in the ruins, and it's addressed to him from his old mentor. He opens up this letter, and the letter addresses him personally, talks about how his powers work, and talks about what he's trying to do in order to fabricate a potential future where mankind survives and the skin threat is defeated. But to do that, he has to allow certain things to happen, certain things he doesn't want to have happen. And so my player is given this letter. It's about 300 words, and it's a full physical prop. He's reading it. And as he's reading it, it ends up with saying, it's like, with the letter saying, I'm balancing my responsibility and my loyalty to the people I care about. And even as I'm writing this, I'm apprehensive to warn you about the 5 men that are going to ambush you the moment you stop reading this letter. Because this guy was he could predict the future so much, he knew that he would I'm giving you critical information, but I know you're going to get ambushed. So do I warn you or not? But he ends it with, it almost is inspired by that moment of Red Dwarf when Crichton goes to his past self with the Lister and says, unfortunately, we die. And the young Crichton goes, well, how? And then Crichton says, well, while we're sitting here arguing about it, the bad guy jumps me from behind like this. And then at that point, the bad guy attacks him and destroys him. And I thought that was a very humorous moment because it's a comedy. So I thought I'd play around with that line and say, while you're, I don't know if I want to warn you about the 5 guys that are going to ambush you the moment you read this letter. And so the player is reading it. And he just goes, and he screams, he swears and throws the paper down. And at that point, I say, okay, roll for initiative. And all the players are like, what are you talking about? Because only one player actually knows he's about to get ambushed. He got to roll for initiative. Everyone else got surprised. But it was a very humorous moment that we got to play off of, getting his legitimate reaction to reading a letter and going, and I don't know if I should warn you that you're about to get ambushed. So that was my prophetic letter. 16 is the only situation where I'm a player. And this is just a pure thing. Just say the fact that I know this may say, well, that means you've never had a good moment when you're a player. You have to understand the ratio. I was a player in my teens, and no, I didn't have a lot of good role-playing moments in that time period with the GMs I had. The GMs weren't very good. And then after that, I just became the GM, and I rarely ever got to be a player. And if I did, they were usually short sessions, 2, 3. They're like one-shots, and they're usually dungeons. And dungeons, there's not a lot of great storytelling, not a lot of great encounters. And once again, I don't want this list to be, there was this great time where we took on a Hydra, and I had great cleave, and I lopped off all the heads in one shot. That didn't happen, actually. That happened to a friend of mine. I was the other player watching that player going, well, that was a quick battle. I guess my daggers of being a ninja aren't going to be very useful in this situation. But there was a situation where we were in a Mechtin game. In a Mechtin game, you very often get to design your own mecha. And a GM will generally give you a budget of construction points, and then you can go off and you can build your mecha however you want to design it, and the GM will tell you what you can and what you cannot use. But it is a very easy game to min-max, and there have been situations where I was a player with other players making their mecha, and they kind of go, I want to have a transformation, or I want to be able to change my size. I want to have 14 different weapons. I want to be able to do this and do that. And someone like me and my other friend, Dave, at the time, we were looking at the situation going, okay, we're not going to do any of that. I like having mechs. I'm going to be nice, I'm going to have flight, 2 arms, 2 legs, and so forth. But I want to maximize my potential. And as a result, very often when I was a player in these games, I would have the most powerful mech over all the players by a significant margin. In fact, in one of the more negative experiences, there was a situation where a bunch of players, we all got aggravated, and we got in a situation where our players fought each other, and I outright destroyed them. And it was such an ugly situation. It was not one of the reasons why I got kicked out of the group, but there was a point where it was not a very healthy situation, and especially considering that I was in this group and 2 or 3 of the members didn't like me, and then on top of that, the characters couldn't intimidate me because I had the most powerful mech in the game, because I simply min-maxed the rules. But in this game, specifically with Dave and I were both experienced mech designers, so we had 2 incredibly overpowered mechs given the level that the GM assumed we were. So at some point, we get ambushed by 20 other of these mechs. And once again, we have no idea on the power level, but the GM has the sheet he has for the opponents. And so they say surrender, and we just go, no. And what proceeds following is a 3-hour battle where the GM vastly underestimated how good our mechs were. He created a bunch of mechs that were they were weaker than us, but we invested so many points in our combat abilities. Our mechs were min-maxed, so we were only getting hit maybe 20-30% of the time. And then we were finding ways to avoid taking damage in critical areas. And then our weapons were so powerful, we were taking out because we were also coordinating. And over the course of 2 or 3 hours, we actually take out all 20 of these guys. Now, by the end of it, I've lost an arm, I've lost a leg, my main body only has maybe 3 hits left. Basically, if there was 2 other guys, one of us would have been destroyed. Dave was near death as well. And we take out all 20 of these. It took 3 hours to do this fight because we are surgically removing one guy at a time, and eventually we managed to win the day. And at that point, we're like, all right, who's next? And the GM is at the end of this like, I don't know. I hadn't actually expected you to win that battle. He was expecting us to surrender. And we didn't. And we kind of broke his game. We had one more session and then the game collapsed. Now that may seem like a negative, but as a player, I'm not going to lie. It was one of the most enjoyable game sessions I think I've had as a player. Just this perfect evolution of mech design working together with this other player to just surgically just take down a vastly superior force. The GM, to his credit, did not take it personal. He didn't try to skew. He didn't try to railroad us. He didn't say, okay, 40 more show up then. Like, he's not trying. He's like, well, no, I put out 20. These are the stats. I'm going to play this fairly. And I really respected him for doing that. I appreciated that he actually didn't. I think another GM would have tried to change the situation to force us to follow what the storyline is. But instead, he let us carry out the course of action, and then we won. And then he didn't know how to fix it. And then eventually the game kind of folded. But I appreciated him letting us go that route and win the day. but it was a fun session. Oddly enough, it was this goes back once again. I say Mectin. I say very protected Mectin Plus and the Mectin Zeta Plus rule system. On the or the not Mectin Zeta is the predicate. Mectin Plus, Mectin Zeta is the second one. Man, memory goes back. But that was a session, yeah, like one session of game. Sometimes these entries are one session, and sometimes these are actually multiple sessions. Which leads to the last entry I'm going to do for this video, which is the revelation of Max. A revelation of Max is a very specific thing. For those people who read Amethyst, you know what Max is. Max is a Goliath large robot that's designed to operate in the magical fields of Earth. So it's able to resist disruption on account of how lumberous and big it is. We didn't have a design for Max. I had an illustration. That illustration Nick used to create the illustration we do know, so they were pretty close to each other. Nick's is I think, more accurate presentation. If you read the novelizations, it's not really mentioned in the game book, but in the novelization, it's mentioned that Max has two modes. It's the mode that everyone knows. It's just this seemingly, it's like a stone golem with a robot inside. He's just this lumbering beast of just iron golem, probably more accurate. But it's just massive. It's got a huge cannon. It's got a massive claw. It's got a very tiny head, but it's sunk in the armor plating all around it. So it's a very hard thing. But the weird thing is that it's assembled in such a way that it can actually compress itself and be transported in a crate about half of its size. I never really go into detail how in the world this thing that's seemingly made out of iron can be transported into a crate the size of a 4x4 pallet, But it does. And in the story, in the novel, a character activates it. One of the antagonists activates it on their own in the forest. In the campaign, it was dropped. Basically, I can't remember if it was dropped intentionally to that location or whether or not it fell and was unactivated. But the players, fantasy characters, they're the ones that activate. They actually have two crates. One of them has like rations, which they think is chocolate poo, which is a conversation for another day. And yeah, I'm not joking. Chocolate poo was an actual thing that somebody said. And the other one activates, and then this thing folds up. Because at this time, my players were still under the assumption that any opponent that they can defeat, like basically anything that they can encounter is something that they can defeat. The GM would never send us an opponent that we can't take out. I had this conversation with Frederick Wheeler on How to RPG, which was also How to D&D back in the day. And in a table, he asked whether or not we ever create monsters our players can't defeat. And I say all the time, once per season, the players will always encounter a beast that they cannot defeat, to make sure that they know that just because you see a monster doesn't mean it's something that they can win against. And in this situation, my players hadn't gotten that letter yet. This was back in the early 2000s. And they didn't get that memo. So they began to engage with Max, who beat the living snot out of them poorly. Like, it wasn't even, like, they weren't even halfway taking down his hit points. And, like, they were hitting, but I wasn't trying to convey the information. Well, he only has 30 hit points left. The GM shouldn't do that, in my opinion. Like, well, does it look damaged? And I'm saying, well, you're denting the armor. And so they got that impression that they're doing something. Well, because of its resistance, most of their damage is getting soaked up by the armor. Very little's going through, and it has a plasma gun and a very big fist, and it's beating the crap out of these guys. And they're only like 7th level. And I think at the time, Max, when I wrote the stats, he was like a challenge rating 10 creature. He was just way more powerful for them. And another player realizes this, and it's like, no, we're leaving. And these two characters, a ranger and a samurai, just basically refuse. They refuse. So they stand pat. So the other character has, on his own, like at this point, I'm just running the game, rolling the dice, doing damage. Gets on his horse, gets two hooks, runs towards the battle, because he's escaped, and runs towards the battle, throws these two hooks, lassos both of them, um, intentionally makes a point that when he loops around the heavier ranger, who's the more belligerent, that the the hook actually gets into his shoulder, wraps around him, hooks in his shoulder, and he literally forces them out of the combat because these guys are saying we're not going to leave. So he runs by them and hooks them both. I have him roll the dice. He succeeds. He loops them both and he forces them away from this battle and he runs off. And then Max, after the engagement, goes back and doesn't even pursue them. It just continues on its mission because it has a mission that doesn't involve these two guys. And so he runs off for like a half an hour until the horse gets tired, and then the players are, they're able to soak up, lick their wounds and try to heal themselves. And it was very, very funny. Like I was like, no, these two characters are gonna die if they stay in this fight. I know that. I'm looking at the stats of Max. And the later thing is that I didn't show them an image at the time because I didn't have that illustration. I had it, but for some reason I think I forgot to play it. And then I showed them what Max looked like, even though I described it as saying it was about 9 feet tall. It looked like an iron golem, except it was a robot, just a giant, heavy armored behemoth. But they still had the idea this thing was unfolding itself from the crate. So when I showed them the illustration, they looked at it and said, if we had known that's what it looks like, we never would have fought it. We would have run away. And I said, what were you expecting? I described it. And they kept on saying, we thought this thing was like a glorified Johnny Five from Short Circuit. And I was just like, but the damage it was inflicting should have been an indicator that you were probably a little outclassed. So it was a very humorous situation, and the fact that it was ended by another player coming in and literally forcing the other players out of combat because he knew that they were leading themselves into a total party kill at that point. Not a total party kill because he would have survived, but these other two characters probably would have been killed. Anyway, that's my first 5 of these top 5 moments from my game life. I'm gonna do some more of these. And if you enjoy them, please tell me in the comments some of your favorite moments in gaming. Not necessarily funny. I don't want a top funniest lines. I want a role-playing moment. I don't want the joke about Rimmer and Red Dwarf and riffs. He rolled a 6 and a 2. I don't want I want a story that is legitimately something that you think about fondly from a gameplay perspective that you either enjoyed as a GM or as a player. Post those in the comments. I look forward to reading them. If you please like and subscribe, and I'll come back with some more videos.